Welcome back to session 4 of Mood Matters. In the previous session, we looked at behaviour-mood links and how what we do can strongly influence our mood. We looked at some of the patterns you may have noticed from tracking your mood and behaviour over the course of a week and how we can go about changing our behaviour in helpful ways. Did you manage to make some changes? Did you notice any improvements in how you felt as a result of these changes? Reflect on how your new behaviours affected your mood. Remember to continue to experiment with your behaviours and activity and continually review and evaluate your progress with this. And persevere. Changing old habits takes time. In this session, we are going to look at the role of unhelpful thoughts in feeding depression and consider some ways to challenge these thoughts so that we can weaken the vicious circle of depression even further. Although we are moving away from a focus on behaviours for the moment, please do continue to use the strategies that have been discussed in previous sessions. So our thoughts, or the way we think about things, strongly affect how we feel. When we are depressed, we tend to view ourselves, situations and other people in very negative ways. Consider some of these questions. Do you often worry about things by going over them again and again in your mind? Do you dwell on the negative or criticise yourself all the time? Do you expect the very worst to happen and jump to the very worst conclusion about everything? Do you tend to focus on what other people think of you? If you find that you are thinking these ways regularly, then it is likely that your thoughts are feeding depression. Let's look at Jane's thoughts. I just feel so empty inside. I feel so worthless. I want people to like me, but there is nothing there to like. I just get in the way. I don't see any way out of this. It all seems so bleak. Take a moment to consider how this woman might be feeling. It is unlikely that anyone could feel happy or indeed good about themselves if these were the types of thoughts they were having. Let's have a look at some of the typical thoughts that people have when they feel depressed. What if type thoughts. So, what if I lose my job? What if I never get a job? What if I can't pay the bills next month? What if I never feel any better? These are what we call hypothetical thoughts, assuming the worst about situations in the future that might never actually happen. These type of negative thoughts feed yet more worry, anxiety and depression. I can't cope. Due to the nature of some of the symptoms we experience when we are depressed, for example, lack of motivation, avoidance behaviours, putting things off and so on, we can gradually begin to feel as though we are losing control over our lives and lose confidence in our ability to deal with situations that ordinarily wouldn't cause us any problems. We may then tell ourselves that we can't cope, which lowers our self-esteem, makes us avoid even more, and keeps the vicious circle going. Things never go right for me. When we are depressed, we tend to focus on the negative events in our lives and dwell on these. We may believe that bad things always happen to us and that things just never turn out the way we would like them to. This can make us feel negative about our situation and contribute to a bleak outlook. I'm useless. When we feel depressed, we tend to be our own worst critic. We may feel like we are struggling with day-to-day life and blame ourselves for feeling the way we do. We may attach a range of negative labels to ourselves, useless being just one of these labels. Again, thinking in these ways can affect our confidence and self-esteem. They all think I'm stupid. How many times have you assumed that you know what someone else thinks of you? We tend to do this quite a lot when we're feeling bad about ourselves. We tend to assume that others view us in a negative way, but we don't actually know this for sure. The only way we would know this to be 100% true would be if the person actually told us. I'll be fine if I just get out of here. As mentioned previously, when we are depressed, we tend to underestimate our ability to cope with situations and may feel that the only way to cope is to escape from these situations. This is what often leads to avoidance behaviours. When we avoid or try to escape from situations, however, we merely reinforce to ourselves that we can't cope and never give ourselves the chance to prove that we can. So the types of thoughts that we have when we are depressed simply tell us that we are useless, that nobody likes us, and that there is no point in doing things. Thoughts like this serve only to feed emotional distress and keep us feeling depressed. So if the types of thoughts we have just looked at are what feed depression, then is it possible that we can learn to think our way out of depression? The answer to this is yes, we can. What we have to do first of all, though, is to start becoming aware of our unhelpful negative thoughts and identify what kinds of situations are likely to trigger thoughts like these. Let's look in more detail at some of the features of unhelpful thoughts. Unhelpful thoughts tend to be automatic and come out of nowhere. Most of the time, we are unaware of the thoughts that we are having in any given situation, and what we tend to be more in tune with is our emotional response to situations. So we tend to remember feeling depressed, we remember feeling anxious, we remember feeling upset. What we don't tend to remember is what was actually going through our mind at that particular time to trigger these negative emotions. Negative thoughts often seem very reasonable, and we often accept them to be 100% true without question. However, this can be problematic because most of the thoughts that we have when we are feeling depressed tend not to be true, but rather are just assumptions or opinions based on how we feel. And don't forget that unhelpful thoughts are the type of thoughts that would make most of us feel depressed. As mentioned previously, unhelpful thoughts can be very difficult to identify. However, if we notice a change in how we feel, for example, becoming more depressed, then it is likely that this emotional change has been triggered by unhelpful thoughts. If we don't tackle unhelpful thoughts, they will continue to make us feel bad about ourselves, and they can become even worse and even more extreme. When we are depressed, we tend to look for and find threats to keep us feeling depressed. Let's look at an example to illustrate. Imagine you are walking down the street and your neighbour is coming towards you. She then crosses the road before she gets to you without acknowledging you. What would your automatic thought be? How would you feel? If we were depressed and on the lookout for threats, it is likely that we would assume that our neighbour had seen us but wanted to avoid us for some reason. We may even start to think that we have done or said something wrong and that our neighbour did not want to talk to us. As a result of these types of thoughts, we may feel bad about ourselves, anxious and worried. We may even change our behaviour as a result of this one situation. For example, instead of carrying on with the rest of our day, we may return home, dwell on the incident, and even go to bed. However, if we were to think about this situation in a more balanced, realistic way, we may realise that there are many other reasons why our neighbour might have walked past us. It could have been that they didn't see us. It could have been that they were having a bad day and were distracted by their thoughts. Or it may have been that they thought that you hadn't seen them. If we had, for example, assumed that our neighbour just hadn't seen us and that they were distracted, our behaviour may have been different. We may have approached our neighbour and asked if everything was okay. We may have then felt better about ourselves as we continued on with the rest of our day. So you can see it is not a situation itself that makes us feel depressed. It is our perception of the situation or how we interpret what's happening. So if two people experience the same situation, for instance, it is unlikely that they will have the same emotional response to the situation because they have interpreted or perceived it in different ways. When we are depressed, we zoom in on threats, we find evidence that back up our fears, and we ignore evidence against our fears. We tend to see only part of a situation, the negative part, and ignore the rest. Let's now turn our attention to managing the thoughts that feed depression. The first thing we have to do is to spot unhelpful thoughts, as not all of our thoughts will be unhelpful. Most unhelpful thoughts fall into certain categories, or what we call unhelpful thinking patterns. Having a better understanding of what these common patterns are can help us to understand and recognise when our thoughts may be unrealistic and unhelpful. Let's take a moment to look at these just now. So, the mental filter is one of the common patterns that our thoughts may fall into when we are feeling low. This refers to the thoughts that we have when we focus on only one part of a situation, usually the negative, and ignore the rest. For example, thinking about one person at work who you don't get on with and dwelling on it, and ignoring the fact that you got on great with everyone else. Jumping to conclusions is something that you may recognise. This is when we make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, again, usually negative in nature, or assume that we know what someone else is thinking. For example, if we are late to meet a friend, we may jump to the conclusion that they think badly of us and that they will end the friendship. We don't know if this is what our friend thinks, it's just an assumption. Labelling is something we touched on earlier on in the session. This refers to the thoughts that are perhaps very self-critical or self-deprecating. For example, saying to yourself, "I'm just a waste of space," or "I'm useless." Catastrophising refers to the thoughts that we have when we blow things out of all proportion. If you catastrophise a lot, then you may find yourself saying things like, "That was a complete disaster," or "That was absolutely terrible." Extreme statements or rules refer to thoughts that usually include the words should or must. For example, "I must be good at everything that I do," or "I should try to please everyone all of the time." Thoughts within this category tend to be related to unrealistic standards that we set for ourselves. And when we set ourselves unrealistic standards, then we are immediately setting ourselves up to fail, which can contribute to making us feel bad about ourselves. Personalisation is blaming ourselves for things that have little or nothing to do with us, or taking responsibility for things that are out with our control. For example, blaming yourself for the behaviour of your adult son or daughter. Black and white thinking is when we see things as being either good or bad and nothing in between. For example, if you think that anything less than perfect is not good enough, then you may be thinking in extreme ways. And overgeneralising is when we assume that based on one bad experience in the past or present, that all current or future situations will follow suit. For example, if you had a previous bad experience in a relationship, you may think that you will never find happiness in a relationship. Or if you tell yourself that because you weren't successful at a job interview, that you will never get a job. To help us to identify if we are thinking in these ways, it can be useful to record our thoughts in a thought diary. Writing your thoughts down in a diary allows us to become more aware of the unhelpful thoughts that we are experiencing in different situations. You are learning a new skill here, so going back to basics and writing things down can help. Let's look at an example. This is Lucy's thought diary. Lucy bumped into a friend that she hadn't seen for a while and felt really anxious and low in mood. When she examined her thoughts, she realised that she was thinking in very negative ways. She was telling herself that she looked a mess, that she didn't have anything interesting to say, and that her friend would think she was boring. Lucy's thoughts in this situation fall into some of the unhelpful thinking patterns that we have just looked at, namely labelling herself as boring, jumping to conclusions by assuming that her friend will think she is boring, and generally focusing on the negatives. Think about a recent time when you felt depressed. Using the worksheet entitled 4-column thought diary, try to record what you were thinking, what was going through your mind, and what the unhelpful thinking styles were. Many of the thoughts that we have when we're depressed tend to be based on our opinion or assumption, but very rarely on any facts. The problem is that we begin to believe that all of our thoughts are 100% true or accurate, and this can have a negative impact on how we feel and what we do. So what we have to do is to begin to question our thoughts and challenge their factual basis. Take a look at this picture. What do you see? There are two faces here, an older lady's face and a younger lady's face. You may only see one of the faces at first, and only after some time see the other. The purpose of this exercise is to point out that there is usually always another way of looking at a situation, but sometimes when we're feeling depressed, we just can't see it. As mentioned earlier, when we are depressed, we tend to see only the negative perspective. Changing the way we think about things, therefore, and trying to see different perspectives can help us to feel less depressed. To help us to look for alternative perspectives and to see the bigger picture, it can be useful to think about what evidence there is to suggest that your thoughts are true, and also the evidence that may suggest that your thoughts are not necessarily true, but rather opinions or assumptions. The aim is that we can consider all relevant facts in a particular situation and try to see it in a more balanced, realistic way, rather than thinking in extreme ways. Let's go back to Lucy's thought diary to illustrate. When Lucy begins to challenge her thoughts, she realises that there is no real evidence to suggest that any of her thoughts are true. She decides that her thoughts are probably as a result of feeling bad about herself at the moment. When she looks at the evidence against her thoughts, however, she can see different perspectives. Weighing up the evidence for and against her negative thoughts enabled her to come to a more balanced conclusion about the situation. When we are able to see a situation just for what it is, instead of thinking in extreme or negative ways, we often feel much better within ourselves. Think back to the unhelpful thoughts you wrote down earlier. Using the worksheet entitled 7-column thought diary, try to challenge these thoughts by looking at the evidence which supports the thoughts and the evidence which contradicts the thoughts, and try to come to a more balanced, realistic perspective. There are some other ways to help you to deal with unhelpful thoughts. For example, it can be useful to think about what a friend or loved one would say to you about the thoughts you're having. Or, what would you say to a friend who is having similar thoughts? What advice would you give them? Can you apply this advice to yourself? Trying to gain some perspective on your thoughts or worries can also help. Ask yourself, will it matter so much in 6 months' time? Will you even remember what the problem was? And if it won't matter in 6 months, it's probably not that important now. It may also help to think about how others would deal with the problem. Think about someone who seems to handle problems well and work out what they'd do or how they'd think in that situation. More questions to challenge your thoughts can be found in the worksheet entitled Handout 1. Over the next week, you may wish to use the thought diary to record and challenge any unhelpful thoughts that you have. Try to come to a more balanced, realistic perspective. The goal is that you'll become an expert in identifying and challenging your own unhelpful thoughts. But remember, it is a new skill and will not happen overnight. It will take time and practice. In time, you may find that you no longer need to record your thoughts in a diary, and that you can learn to do the skill in your head. We have now reached the end of session 4. We hope you found this session helpful. In the next session of the course, we will turn our attention back to some of the behaviours that keep the vicious circle of depression going, namely avoidance, putting things off, and rumination. We will also discuss practical problem solving.